Hello and welcome to Scott's Odyssey. Have you ever been blessed or lucky enough to see a fairy ring or a fairies playground in Pennsylvania? I have, on many occasions throughout all of central Pennsylvania and well up into the wilds. Now, some will tell you the rings are Marasmius oretes or Agaricus campestris or even the poisonous Chlorophyllum molybdites, all forms of mushrooms that grow deep in the earth and bloom with a ring of much smaller pallid stems in order to spread their spores. Or maybe the fairy playground will just be a ring of trees that have grown because the older tree that was once in the middle has died off and disappeared from current history. But sometimes, when I'm out and about, I come across these rings and playgrounds and, well, I prefer to remember the old ways of acknowledging these sites, the who we once were and how we believed in things bigger and better than ourselves. That brings us to today's podcast, where I will retell a story once told of exactly why we have these fairy rings and fairy playgrounds. The history of the fairy parks, historically recorded and written by Henry Wharton Shoemaker. See you in a minute. Fairies in central Pennsylvania? Why, certainly there are. Lots of them hereabouts, said old man Baumeister as he emptied his corncob pipe against the rock on which we sat under the mountain ash tree. Right down the pike is where they make their headquarters. They've been dancing and playing there now for over 50 years, and they're increasing in numbers as fast as dandelions. Every year they're making new parks or playgrounds until now there are more than a dozen of them between the top of Grindstone Hill and where the road dips down to the Pine Creek. I had often noticed these parks or circular patches of trees and green sward and admired their beauty, wondering at their odd form and apparent immunity from forest fires. Now, it was all being explained to me. The little people make a ring on the first night of the new moon, the old man continued, and dance around it until the moon goes down that night. After that, the fires can't pass their boundary. The trees grow nicely and the grass stays green. Travelers like to rest there and pasture their horses. They always seem to have a cool breeze to spare, for the fairies have the kindliest and most lovable feelings towards mankind. They want to make things pleasant for them. But on moonlit nights, then's when you see the fun. The parks swarm with the gay little folk, but they are so shy it's difficult for a person to see them first. I don't believe fairies are native to America. Never heard tell of any Pennsylvanians except our little colony along the pike. They wouldn't be here if it wasn't for one old woman. She hated to leave the fatherland unless she could bring some fairies with her. At first her relatives objected, but she had her way and brought a dozen of them in a black bag. I've often heard my parents tell the story. They came from the same village in Württemberg as Grandmam Swartz, the old lady who fetched the fairies. When she was young Lotti Rudicelli, they say that she was the prettiest girl for miles and miles, the prettiest blonde that imagination could conjure up. She was much given to wandering in the woods, especially on moonlit nights, and the neighbors would have ascribed this to sentimentality if she hadn't been so indifferent to the young men. Some thought she met a lover in the forest depths. Nothing else could take a girl alone into such secluded localities. But it was a long time before anyone had the courage to follow her. She seemed so haughty and reserved. There was a young man in the village named Wilhelm Schwartz, a sort of country gallant, whom all the girls except Lotti, the solitary wanderer, had loved at one time or another. Her indifference piqued him to such an extent that he came to sincerely love the one girl who wouldn't notice him. Often he had the desire to follow her on her lonely rambles. He had a jealous impulse to meet her secret lover and drive him away. But he feared the villagers would see him follow her into the forest and twit him when he came back, shamefaced and with head hanging. But one evening, it was the first night of a new moon, and the silvery crescent was dancing above the tops of the tall spruces. As he walked along through the sweet-scented woods, he came upon a place that the path led down a steep hillside, where a brook tumbled along beneath the giant trees. Through an opening in the evergreen boughs, he could see quite a distance ahead of him. To his amazement, he saw Lotti seated on a mossy log, surrounded not by one, but by 100 admirers. They were not big, stalwart lads like himself, but tiny chaps, scarcely a foot high, clad in tight-fitting suits of green and yellow. They held hands as they danced about her, sometimes breaking into weird little songs in a minor key. Many little women dressed in bodiced skirts of the same colors sat nearby on little hillocks or bunches of grass. Lotti seemed to be their queen, and was radiantly happy as her company. It seemed a pity to break in on such a merry, innocent scene, and Wilhelm would not have done so intentionally. In an effort to draw nearer to obtain a better view, he stepped on a dry root which cracked audibly. Lotti looked up, recognizing him instantly, while the fairy band scampered out of sight under leaves, stumps, rocks, and logs with the alacrity of chipmunks. Lotti had too equable a disposition naturally, and was in too happy a frame of mind at this particular moment to mind the intrusion, and accepted Wilhelm's profuse apologies with smiling goodwill. They had known one another, though not well, for a long time, so it did not seem like being too forward when the young man seated himself beside her on the mossy-grown log. Nervously plucking a fern, he began talking to her as if they had met under the most ordinary circumstances, and not as the result of his breaking up a fairy merry-go-round. Strange as it may seem, Lotti treated him better on this occasion than she ever had before, or any other man for that matter. He was so good-looking, he had such wonderful expression, and never showed off to better advantage than this night bathed in ghastly moon rays. He was tactful enough to make no allusion to the party he had disturbed, and as she made no effort to explain, it seemed to be the one subject unmentioned during their blissful tryst in the forest. "What will my parents say?" gasped Lotti, putting her hand to her head in a gesture of terror as she noticed the hands of the village clock pointing to 2 as they neared her home. But whether they protested or not, or even knew when she got home, is not a part of this story. Wilhelm had started on a successful wooing. Nothing could stop him now. How far he progressed that night is also a mystery, but he doubtless kissed her. Who could have protested on such a beautiful night? It was soon noticed by the villagers that Wilhelm Schwartz always accompanied Lotti on her rambles into the forest. If she had been meeting someone else previously, clearly that suitor had fallen into disfavor, or it might be she had been meeting Wilhelm all along. But that couldn't be the case either. He had been noticed too many times gazing after her ruefully, cap in hand, as she disappeared in the shadowy depths. Her conduct had always been a mystery anyway. This interest in Wilhelm, so handsome and so strong, was the one normal act in her life. About this time, there was great talk in the little mountainous community about emigrating to America. Land could be bought outright very cheap in all the states, especially in Pennsylvania, which was said to teem with prosperous Germans. Some few had gone over already and wrote back glowing accounts of the riches of the new country, but above all, the social equality and opportunities which awaited everyone. There were no landlords, no supercilious nobility. Anyone could rise who had energy and a fair share of adaptability. Wolfgang Kudiselli and his good wife Minnie, the parents of Lotti, caught the passing enthusiasm. They began corresponding with a neighbor who was in northern Pennsylvania, and that individual, to make sure of them, had the foreign agents of several land companies in Philadelphia visit their home and paint pictures that can only be described as glorious. Why the emigrants in the wild Pennsylvania hills were so anxious that more of their kind should follow them may be ascribed to 2 reasons. They may have been lonesome for more friends from home, or, like the monkey with his tail off, wanted others in the same predicament. There was only one member of the ODDDySEEy family who objected to the proposed change of destiny, and that was Lotti. Her older brothers and sisters thought the idea a grand one. They were tired of being branded as peasants, tired of filling a place in life from which caste would give them no escape. They would go to a land of freedom where their children might even become presidents. Lotti, hitherto the proudest of the family, was the only one who wanted to remain. "You can be a great lady over there," her brothers urged. But this appeal to her vanity, once so potent, was of avail no longer. Wilhelm Schwartz had always cherished a secret hankering for the New World, and when he heard the talk in the ODDDySEEy household, he told his sweetheart he'd gladly go along. They could marry just as well in Pennsylvania as in Württemberg. Easier, in fact. They did not publish bans over there. No tests or qualifications were required of candidates for marital happiness in the land of the free. But to his surprise, Lotti said she wasn't going. The others could go, but she would remain. It took some time for Wilhelm to learn her reason. Had she not been so much in love with him, it would have been impossible. A woman regards a reason as the one secret she can keep. But finally she confessed why she was so wedded to the hills of old Württemberg. One night, when she was a wee girl, so she said, she had strayed into the forest. Evening was coming on, and everything gleamed so clear-cut in the final cadences of the golden hour. The pines and spruces seemed to the tiniest needle carved out of the transparent ether. The air seemed so sweet, it must have been freshly let loose from realms celestial. She had sat down to rest by the waterfall, which created its own little rainbow in the maze of froth and spray. She was entranced by the scene. Anybody, young or old, would have been, until she was aroused from her contemplations by the sound of squeaky voices, like old men talking far away, only these voices were near at hand. Presently, she saw the speakers. They were a horde of tiny fairies, nothing else, clad in tight-fitting suits of yellow and green. They waved their hands to her and made every effort to become acquainted. She wasn't a bit frightened. There were such merry twinkles in the little fellow's eyes that they surely meant no harm. She waved to them, and they came close to where she sat and began conversing in a friendly, cheerful manner. Once they were at their ease, and a troop of little lady fairies, dressed in bodiced skirts of bright colors, came out of the underbrush and sought the young girl's acquaintance. Their spokesman explained to her they had always regretted the gulf which existed between them and the big people, but in her they had found a happy medium. They could love her. Would she consent to become their queen? Lotti at that time didn't have a very definite idea what the word queen meant, but she had heard that there was one in Württemberg, so high above their subjects that many doubted she was of the same clay. Yes, she would become their queen gladly, if it would do them any good. The fairies were delighted. They joined hands and danced about her, singing gaily. When she returned home, she had difficulty in explaining to her family what had kept her so long in the forest. She had lost her way. That was the best excuse her childish shrewdness could invent. After that, it was difficult to restrain her from wandering in the forest. Threats of punishment were unavailing. She was naturally a headstrong girl and the family pet, so she knew her family really meant nothing. As she grew older, the family began to realize that her solitary strolls were harmless. They had heard of people loving nature. Their daughter must be one of these strange creatures. But it was her duty as a queen of the fairies to go among her subjects as often as possible. She made a gracious queen as she grew in loveliness and charm with each succeeding year. But love for a mortal had come into her life, and her family wanted to emigrate to America. Her lover was also anxious to go to the new country. Everything seemed to point to her departure from her fairy kingdom. She was unhappy now for the first time in 18 years of her life. Her brow, formerly smooth as marble, now showed lines of thought. She was sure she loved Wilhelm dearly. Her family had always been good to her, but how could she leave the little people who had elected her their queen? Wilhelm's pleading prevailed. After shedding a few tears, she resolved to go. She was not a sneak nor a coward. She resolved to break the news to her tiny subjects before starting on the long journey. One night in June, when the new moon had appeared, she went to the fairy rendezvous accompanied by Wilhelm. Calling her beloved subjects about her, she explained to them the steps she was about to take. Her voice was choked with sobs, but every one of her audience understood why her love for her sweetheart and family should be the controlling motive in her life. Just when she finished talking, one little shrill voice piped up. "May I go with you?" Immediately, all the others clustered about her, taking up the same refrain. "May we go along? May we go with you?" They held Lotti's hands tightly, and some clambered all over Wilhelm, striving like squirrels to hide themselves in the pockets of his velveteen jacket. Their demands were so sincere and importunate that the young girl smilingly declared that she would take as many fairies with her to America as she could carry in a wool sack. There was a cheer from the little people. They would follow her to the ends of the earth, they insisted. But a process of selection must be made. Which fairy should go, which should remain? It was decided to draw lots with twigs of hazel after Wilhelm would come back with the wool sack. He started to the village, returning with a sack of black material, such as was used in those days. The lots were drawn. A long twig meant go, a short one stay, until the bag was filled. 12 fairies, 6 men, 6 women were chosen, and hid their smiling faces in the hot, stuffy sack. The others kissed the fortunate ones goodbye, and with no recriminations, danced away to their homes under the rocks and roots. Wilhelm saw to it that air holes were provided so that the little voyagers would not be smothered, for fairies are, in a sense, human. They are like us, except that there are no diseases among them. They are, in a sense, immortal. 2 days later, the ODDDySEEy family, accompanied by their faithful Wilhelm Schwartz, began their tedious journey to the land of promise. It was fraught with untold inconveniences and delays in those days, by diligence and goods train interrupted. By frequent changes of conveyance, they proceeded to Paris. Wilhelm and Lotti had many adventures with the wool sack, to be sure. To the old folk and inquisitive brothers and sisters, it contained kittens, rabbits, white rats, fairies, anything to the baggage and customs officials, vegetables, meats, clothing, whatever seemed advisable. Wilhelm was well provided with money, but it ate into his store to tip everyone into silence who might question the well-filled wool sack. Many complications would otherwise have arisen, especially in France, where none of the party knew a word of the prevailing language. It was a critical trip for Wilhelm. He had promised Lotti to see that her little friends reached America in safety. He could not disappoint in his first real effort to augment her happiness. The party embarked on a sailing vessel at Havre, and were 3 months at sea, alternately becalmed and tempest-tossed. Lotti kept the little people in her bunk by day, but let them out at night, to scamper about the decks, sometimes scaring the other passengers, who thought the ship bewitched. But they were too agile to be captured, or even be wholly seen by outsiders. They were fed with what Lotti and Wilhelm could snatch from the mess, and also with nuts, berries, and roots, their favorite food, brought along just for this purpose. The customs officers at Old Castle Garden couldn't have been very alert at that time, for the mysterious black wool sack passed through unmolested. It is said that an OK U.S. Customs was tied on it. It may be that fairies are providentially lucky. They have to be if they are mortals. Outside the imposing building, one of the old neighbors, Karl Eichelmann, who had lived near the ODDDySEEys in Württemberg, was waiting. He greeted them with a wild burst of delight. Here were people, his people, who had actually seen his beloved hills and vales and waterfalls in dear old Württemberg a little less than 4 months ago, while he had not seen them in 16 long, toilsome years. There was also a representative of the real estate company at the landing. He would help pilot and install them in their new home in Pennsylvania. Then they were escorted up Broadway, marveling at the wonders of New York, across the waters of the Hudson in a ramshackly ferry boat, and aboard a train for Philadelphia. At the City of Brotherly Love, they spent the night, starting away the next morning, changing cars 3 or 4 times until they reached a place called Auntie's Fort, on a railroad which they were told had just been completed 2 months before. The engines were wood burners and moved slowly enough through the country so that they could admire its fertility and grandeur. They marveled at the number of persons who got in the cars, who looked like Americans but who spoke a dialect that sounded like German. At Auntie's Fort, 2 teams were waiting to convey them on the last stage of their journey to the uncleared tract of land on the pike, which they were to make blossom like a rose. Most of the way, the road led through a virgin forest. The trees were even taller than in the fatherland. The waterfalls were wider. The silence was more intense. At length, they came to a small opening in the forest, made by cutting the trees so that they fell against their standing neighbors. In the center of it was a log shack. They use it now for a woodshed. Here, the ODDDySEEys were to stay until they cleared more land and built a more respectable abode. The tract that they had bought comprised 160 acres, more or less, so the deeds ran. It was past dark when they arrived, so that they could not tell whether they were pleased or not, but they were probably too tired to care either way. Soon a new moon appeared, shimmering between galaxies of unstable stars. Wilhelm and Lotti had noted a cozy little nook along the road. It was near a waterfall and a spring, where they decided to liberate the fairy band. After partaking of a light supper, they were too excited to eat much. They started down the pike, carrying the bag between them. When they reached the pretty spot, they emptied the sack. The little people shouted in treble ecstasies of joy and began dancing merrily. They formed a circle and danced about the couple who had safely carried them so far. The young couple had much work ahead of them, so they probably took less notice of their surroundings henceforth than the fairies. The little people were immensely pleased. It was their Black Forest over again, but on an amplified scale. Lotti intended visiting them each night, but she felt so tired she postponed it a week. One night, the family heard an awful screaming and wailing in the wilderness. It sounded like some frail woman in distress. They were all for running out with torches to find her, until Karl Eichelmann, who was still staying with them, explained it was a panther, or as he pronounced it, a panthère, an animal bigger and more rapacious than the traditional lions of the Bible. All the family except Lotti were satisfied by this explanation, but it only made the girl more uneasy. "I'm afraid," she whispered to Wilhelm, "that it has eaten my little people, and enjoying them has come to devour us." The next night she went in fear and trembling to the fairy abode, and called to the little colony. To her surprise, they all responded, and danced and sang about her gleefully. "I feared you were all eaten by that awful monster which screamed around our cabin last night. I never expected to see you again." The fairies laughed outright. "Panther? Eat us? Never fear. It did chase us, but we were too quick." Lotti was reassured, and on succeeding nights, when she heard the panthers wail and the wolves call, she knew her little friends were safe. They thrived in their new home. Children were born to them, for fairies are partly human. They were happy. Lotti married Wilhelm the next spring, but continued her visits to the fairy home, even after her own children were born. Occasionally, Wilhelm accompanied her. At times, she would say she would go back to Württemberg for a visit before she died and take the fairies along, but for some reason they didn't enthuse. It can only be surmised that they were not sentimental creatures. Fairies own no fatherland. As she grew older, and especially after Wilhelm's death, Lotti became known as Grandmam Schwartz, and her connection with the fairy colony was generally acknowledged. Even her children admitted she was a trifle queer, and her grandchildren were even more positive of it. But she pursued the even tenor of her way, a good wife and mother, hard-working and plodding, until in her 70th year, from the infirmities of age, she passed away. She was buried in the Little Mountaineer Cemetery on Grindstone Hill, and her grave is marked by a rough slab of mountain brownstone. They say, and I'll admit I've seen it once myself, that on a certain June night, when the young moon first comes up from behind the Bald Eagle Mountains, the fairy band, old and young, congregate there and dance daintily, which seems to be their only form of worship, about the ivy-grown mound.